Welcome to today's book talk, The People on the Beach, authored by Rosie Whitehouse. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'm Ellen Resnick, the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. CWB stands as a beacon of experiential learning dedicated to enriching minds and hearts through education. As we celebrate 13 years of groundbreaking programming, our commitment to fostering inclusivity and social justice remains steadfast. Together, we've hosted an impressive array of programs. In the past 3 years alone, welcoming nearly 79,000 participants from 58 countries and 46 states. While the numbers speak volumes, it's the stories, connections, and transformations that truly define our impact. In 2024, we're thrilled to unveil 24 captivating events planned to date. If you would like to make a donation to support our mission, I will drop the donation link in the chat for you in a few minutes. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rosie Whitehouse. Rosie is a seasoned journalist with a distinctive focus on delving into Jewish existence post-Holocaust. Her insightful narratives grace the pages of publications such as BBC Online, The Observer, The Independent, Tablet Magazine, The Jewish Chronicle, Haaretz, and more. A proud alumni of the London School of Economics, Rosie also serves as historical advisor of Centropa, a prominent Jewish history institute headquartered in Vienna. Facilitating today's discussion is Dr. Josh Andy, a teacher at Winchester Thurston School, an educational leader and Holocaust scholar with Classrooms Without Borders. Josh is an accomplished and award-winning educator. He holds a PhD in Russian and Eastern European Studies from Birmingham University. He has traveled internationally to global cultures and issues and to study global cultures and issues as part of his work to design engaging courses for his students. Please send any questions you may have directly to Josh via the chat. We will do our best to answer them all. And with that, Josh and Rosie, the floor is yours.
Ellen, thank you so much. Rosie, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was wonderful to read your book.
Just to say, it's Classrooms Without Borders, and I'm here in London, so living up to the name.
Yeah. It was wonderful to read your book about a year ago, and then reach out to you because with Zippy Gur, our director, her mom was on the Wedgwood, and I was looking for more information as I researched her story. And we had a wonderful chat, and you showed me some amazing pictures of the villa. But my first question to you is, tell us how you came to be interested in the story of the Wedgwood, and just came to know one of the last ships allowed into the mandate.
Well, I'm a freelance journalist, as you already mentioned, and as a result, I have to wear lots of hats. And one of the hats that I sometimes have on my head is being a travel writer and a guidebook writer. And I have authored a guidebook to Liguria, which is the northwestern province of Italy, around Genoa, known as the Italian Riviera. And while I was researching, updating this book, I decided that I was very interested in post-war Italian history, and was interested in, at that point, writing something about it. I didn't know what. And I just started typing in the names of the main towns and then putting 1945, 1946. And I typed in Savona, that's a port to the west of Genoa. And I put in 1946, and bing, up comes a news story saying, in the middle of the night, 1,300 Jews turn up on a beach in a tiny little port called Vado, which is still pretty minuscule today. It's where you catch the ferry to go to Corsica. And they got on a boat which had sailed from New York. And I thought, well, this is a pretty flipping strange story. And then my father-in-law was in shipping in Italy. My father-in-law was Jewish. And so I thought, well, we'll start to ask his friends. He's no longer with us. Well, they knew about the story, and everyone was completely blank. So my husband's also a reporter. We went down to the beach in Vado, and we started asking questions. And we met a fisherman who remembered the story of the boat. And he described how the Jews arrived really gaunt and miserable looking in the middle of the night and sailed away. So that was confirmation that it actually happened. But as I drove home, I was full of questions. It was like, how did 1,300 Jews possibly know a boat was coming from America? And why, if you were trying to leave Eastern Europe, would you go all the way to somewhere near Genoa? There were plenty of more sensible ways to go. And who were these people, and who paid for their ticket? So that's how I began to research the story. And that brings us to the relevant bit, which links me with you guys, because I realized that if I wanted to tell this story, I had to find out who these people were. And that's why the book's called The People on the Beach. I could have called it The Jews on the Beach, but I thought, no, these are people. They're all really different and they've got different hopes and aspirations. The one thing that links them all together is that they're Jewish, but they're, after all, simply people. And I had to find out who these people were. They soon became my people. And eventually I discovered my first list, which was a list made by the Jewish Agency when the Josiah Wedgwood, which is the name of the ship we're talking about, was dragged into Haifa by the Royal Navy. And they took down the names of the people on the boat. Well, that was a start. They gave their name, their country of origin, and their year of birth. But the problem was that many of these people had changed their names on the boat. Many of the women had remarried, and it was very complicated to follow. But I decided in the end to include this list that I eventually put together in the back of the book, because I hoped that one day I'd find out more about them. And that's precisely why I'm here. I was dead right, and now I know all about Sippy's parents. And in the new edition of the book, which is coming out in the autumn, we'll be able to include in a little short form their stories and those stories of many other people who have got in contact with me. So the list has meant a lot to me, and it's been the driving force.
That's wonderful. And that's my second question is, it's not only about what happens in 1940, like the story doesn't begin when the people get on the boat on the Wedgwood. You go back into their stories before 1939, who these individuals were, and again, how do you get the knowledge to do something like this? So I wonder if you could tell us a little about your process of, once you hear the story, how do you start to unravel sources and where archives are and how to reach out to the survivors on the Wedgwood that are still alive?
Okay, well, I think this is where I bring a different set of skill sets to people. I'm a reporter and a journalist. I'm a travel writer. So my natural reaction was to get in my car and drive to where they came from. Which is precisely what I did. Although in the case of the first place I went to, which I'll talk about in a minute, I went on a train from Kiev to Rivne. But my natural reaction was to go and to see the place, because one thing I know as a reporter is that you can't understand anything until you actually go and see something, until you've actually stood there and you've spoken to people who still live there now. It's impossible to understand what really happened. You have to see it with your own eyes. So there wasn't much in the archives about this story anyway. And so I decided that once I'd begun to identify some of the key people on the list, that I would start to follow their story. And the story in the book begins in Rivne, which is a town now in Western Ukraine. In 1939, it was a town in the most eastern corner of Poland. And it was then occupied by the Russians, and then it was liberated by the Red Army in February 1944. So it was the first pre-war Polish territory to be liberated by the Soviet Army. And this is really important because at this point the Soviets had not decided exactly what they were going to do with this territory. And they really didn't care about the people who lived there, largely because they were mostly Poles and Jews, and they were quite happy if they left and they could bring in Soviet citizens, mostly NKVD people. Now, one young man who sailed on the Josiah Wedgwood was called Yitzhak Kaplan. And I decided that I would go in search of Yitzhak Kaplan. And so I went to Rivne. I went and I walked around Rivne. I met lots of people in Rivne. And I began to understand the true horrors of what had happened there, because the massacres that happened in Rivne in late 1941 were part of the tipping point into genocide, when the Nazis and their collaborators began to kill children. And the murder in Rivne was particularly, I mean, it's really difficult to say this because you can't really compare mass murders, but this has a particularly nasty turn and really screams genocide, genocide, genocide at you, because they killed 23,000 Jewish people in the Sasenki forest, but they killed 5,000 Jewish children in separate death pit. And I've not come across another story like that. So I naively assumed, I was still looking for Yitzhak Kaplan. It took me about 18 months to find the man, I have to say. I used to wake up at night and think, I've got to get him, otherwise he might die, and open up my computer and start searching. And eventually I did find him, but I assumed that he had left Rivne because of this massacre. And when I went to meet him in his house in Haifa, I was amazed to discover that, in fact, the massacre had nothing to do with it. And he and his family, who had survived behind enemy lines in the Soviet Union, thought that they could return to Rivne and rebuild their lives. His sister had married a partisan, and the partisans in Rivne were key in trying to help the survivors rebuild their lives. And they were the first of the partisans to do this, because they were the first who were liberated. This happened in many other places subsequently, but at this point, we're very early on. We're February 1944, and these partisans had fought with the Red Army and liberated the city. And this news soon got back to Moscow, where it was not treated as very good news whatsoever. And it was just, eventually the partisans got the tip off that if they stayed, they would be sent to the Gulag. It was also far too dangerous for Jews to stay in Rivne, because Rivne was a place where there was extraordinary ethnic cleansing, as there was right across this region in the immediate post-war period. Well, in the case of Western Ukraine, it went on into the 1950s, where Ukrainians were fighting Poles, and then Ukrainians were fighting the NKVD, and it was just too simply dangerous to be Jewish in the middle of it all. And what makes you realize how dangerous it was, that these people from Rivne, they left in the summer of 1944. That's actually while Hungarian Jewry are being exterminated.
Mm-hmm.
These people set out across Western Europe. And to me, this was the most extraordinary thing, that they had been driven out by danger, but also by communism, by Stalinism. And they were prepared to take this extraordinary risk. And I think it's something that we forget in the context of, if we just look at the Holocaust in a historical way, of just being in the, of course, just being in an archive. Because of course, if you go to Western Ukraine, the Holocaust is a little bit of a problematic issue, because the monuments, which have grown increasingly in the last decade since the annexation of Crimea in Western Ukraine, they sit rather uncomfortably next to monuments to Stepan Bandera and the Ukrainian nationalists.
Yeah, I think sitting in Pittsburgh in the United States, I think one of the things that we could do better at with history is the existence of violence, especially in Eastern Europe after both wars, after World War I and World War II, in places like Western Ukraine, Lithuania. May 8th and 9th, 1945, the war doesn't stop in these places. And you're right that for a lot of sort of former Soviet Jewry, they're liberated first, right? And so they're being able to start to make some decisions, or come under a different occupations when the Soviets move back in.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's really important to put it in this context of early 20th century history and early 20th, was first half of the 20th century violence. Because if you really want to go back to the nitty gritty of what's going wrong here, is that during the Battle of the Somme, the German High Command decided that they were going to carry out a survey of Jewish soldiers in the German army to find out if they were pulling their weight. And they decided to make a recording of every single one, both dead and alive, as to what they'd been doing during the Battle of the Somme. The fact that they were doing this fed this myth that German Jews were not fighting, not pulling their weight. This was never, the survey was never published, but it left people like Adolf Hitler convinced that the Jews in the German army were not only a waste of time, but were also a dangerous fifth column. And of course, the dangerous fifth column is what drives these massacres in places like Rivne. And the bloodbath. It's tipped over in places like Latvia, which most people wouldn't consider particularly important in the Holocaust, but it's actually one of the most crucial places in the whole story.
Yeah, it is. And you have In Western Ukraine, and Ukraine's in the news every day, and we talked before we started that your husband's in Avdiivka, that Western Ukraine, in the teens and the late teens and 20s, about 100,000 Jews are killed in massacres and pogroms in Ukraine by the Red Army, by the Bolsheviks, by the Ukrainian nationalists, by the Poles who move in, right? This is it's almost, if we connect it to today, right? From 1945 until 14 was sort of the exception to the rule of history in Eastern Europe, that borders were fixed.
And of course, we're missing here this crucial element of Romania, because there were a couple of hundred Romanians who sailed on the Josiah Wedgwood, and I looked for them really, really hard. Just after the fall of Ceausescu, my husband and I lived in Romania for 18 months, and I've always had a soft spot for Romania. So I wanted to find these Romanians, but I wanted to find these Romanians largely because I wanted to prove the myth that Antonescu protected the Jews as wrong. And I wanted to tell the story of what happened in Transnistria. And actually, before my husband went to the front line in Ukraine, he was actually helping with another project, which I can talk about later, but was it about going to the mass murder sites in Odessa, where 24,000 in one place he went to take a photograph. Jews were burnt alive in a barn, not by Germans, not by Ukrainians, but by Romanians. And this is a story that's just been brushed under the carpet and needs to be brought to light. And I was very sad that I couldn't do that in People on the Beach. And one of the reasons I couldn't do that was, again, going back to these problems of lists and people's names, is that for some reason, all the bright sparks at the Jewish Agency on the port side in Haifa decided to Slavize all the Romanian names, which made it almost impossible for me to find them. Also because there was literally no documentation in Transnistria, where people just were living in collective farm pigsties. There was no paperwork. There was none of this stuff that we think about with the lists. And these lists that remain in our head, they're really lists of deporting of German Jews, Austrian Jews, Italian Jews, and French Jews in particular, that we have these lists. There was a chaos, just total chaos in the East.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that in most books that I read about the Holocaust that hits home, is there's not one singular Jewish experience.
Absolutely. And I really felt that
matters, and
with my people, that each one of them had a totally individual story, and they left for many reasons. I mean, one that I'll highlight here is a guy called Joseph Harmatz, who was he was a partisan in Lithuania, fighting alongside very famous Abu Kovna. And Joseph Harmatz decided that he would stay in Lithuania to build a better Lithuania, because of course we forget that many Jews in the interwar period were not Zionists. They were socialists, and they wanted to build a better world. And he decided that he would stay in Lithuania, but eventually all of his friends, well, not all of his friends, because I did go there and meet a partisan lady who still lives there, Frania Brantovskaya, but some of them got trapped behind. But many of them, like his best friend Abu Kovna, left because it was too dangerous to stay. And actually, what Harmatz said, that he left because it was the pull of friendship, and that he needed to be with his friends. And after you've lost so much of your family, you had to rebuild your world with your friends. And partisans like Harmatz and Kovna, and indeed, I don't know enough about Sipi's parents, but I suspect they're all part of this. They were the people who built this route, which enabled the people to come behind them to this Harbrika route, which was to bring people out of Europe. They were finding the way out, connecting with the embassies from the Jewish Agency, who'd parachuted behind lines, who were then bringing the money to help to pay, and the Jewish Agency is paying this. The JDC is bringing the cash to pay for all this, and the partisans were core in building these links, because one of the things I first discovered, back to the lists of people on the Josiah Wedgwood, was that there was a startling number of partisans on the list. And, many of the demographics on this list, you could fall into a trap saying, oh, there's more Poles than anybody else because more Jews lived in Poland in the interwar period. Well, that wasn't actually the case. It's that the Jewish Agency favored Poles because they were all part of the same political organizations as them. They didn't favor Greeks, as I do tell the story in the People on the Beach. But they also favored the partisans because they were good at organizing stuff. And they were the ones who went on, particularly by the time the story of the People on the Beach gets to Italy, to actually organize these illegal immigrant ships that were leaving for the Palestine Mandate.
Yeah, I think, a couple of things that are coming to mind. We're just in the book you talk about survivors discussing we can't go home. They realize that they're unwelcome. I think most of us on here would know the story of July 4th, 1946 in Kielce. Each summer I go with Sirve Bida Starahovica, and there were in early 1940, the summer of 1945, 27 survivors were murdered there by their Polish neighbors. So Kielce might be the most prominent or the most well known, but across Eastern Europe, survivors are being killed when they return, beginning in 1944. So, the discussion of where to go, and these 1,300 people are seeking a place in the British Mandate in Palestine and to help to build what becomes Israel.
Which I would say is not unusual. I mean, one of the things that I also do, and it's kind of relevant to you guys, because I think you all know Howard Chandler, who many of you travel with. And Howard Chandler was a member of a group of child Holocaust survivors who came to the UK after the war. They're known as the boys, although irritatingly there were about 280 girls, but there you go. And this group, the boys of 732 child Holocaust survivors, they were when they first said where they wanted to go, every single one of them said Palestine. And it's the same with people in the book. I relate this one story, which was a survey done by the JDC, in which they asked many people in the DP camps in Germany, where would you like to go? And they wrote Palestine first, and they wrote second, gas chamber. And that they could not see anywhere else that they could go. I mean, there was also very little choice where you could go. These 732 children were brought to the UK, but that was about it. We have a terrible record here for actually looking after Jews both before and after the war, despite the fact that we're always blowing our trumpets about kinder transport, and many people at this point were also regarding the British Empire as the new enemy.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I think if we hold on to this, there's whether the partisans are sort of oversampled in these 1,300, they do have these skill sets that the agency is looking for. It also goes into a lot of the stories, the individual stories that you tell in the book. They go on to help found Israel in the sense of the partisans are join the the Haganah or the Palmach, and then they join the fight in 1948. So I wonder if you could talk about that, of the ones that you interviewed in Haifa and Tel Aviv, of that part of the story.
Actually, what I did was I did all the research and driving around Europe for this book before I went to Israel to speak to the survivors. One or two of the stories I tell are from testaments that people gave who are no longer here with us. But I did then go to Israel when I'd gathered all the evidence, because again, as a journalist, I know full well if you go and start floundering around and trying to ask people questions that you don't know the answer to, they're going to pull the wool over your eyes, and they're not going to tell you the truth. So I went like a policeman with my little notebook, saying, where were you on the day of this, and what did you do? Yes, in fact, what happened to these people was, because they arrived in 1946, they arrived way ahead of the vast majority of the Holocaust survivors who arrived during the war in 1948. And so they managed to accrue quite an elite position within Israeli society, because they had already been there before the war broke out, and they fought in 1948, and that helped a lot of them. Not all of them. Many of them were very impoverished. They were very sick. They had to leave Israel because they could not cope with the continuing conflict, and they were advised by psychiatrists to leave. Others left again because they found relatives in other countries, and the pull of family was bigger than the pull of Israel. And these, I think, are very human motivations for what they were doing. But the main point of what they were doing when they were trying to leave Europe was desperation. And this is one of the things that I think is really, really important, and why I'm really pleased to be here speaking to educators and speaking here in Classrooms Without Borders, because one of the things that people don't really know much about is about the British involvement in the Palestine Mandate. And it's not taught in schools here in the UK. And very little is said about it. I also have a personal connection with this because my grandfather was in the First World War in fighting the Ottomans in order to establish the Palestine Mandate. And he actually trained the Jabotinsky Brigade, and he was very involved in this. He was an Irish Catholic, but only person in our family ever took up a gun for Israel. But this story of what we were doing in Palestine, what this mandate actually was, and how it just fitted into the bigger picture of the British Empire, which of course led by divide and rule. You've got some natives out there, man, who just set them against each other, so set Jews against Arabs. And that's great when they need the British to keep everything under control. And the way the British were behaving in the Palestine Mandate, there are many questions that should be asked about it. And then, of course, in March 1939, they imposed these restrictions in the White Paper, which limited immigration into the Palestine Mandate just at the moment that people really needed it. And it was very significant because it was these restrictions which came about on the eve of war that really made people like Eichmann begin to play around with concepts of the Lublin Reservation, the Nisko Plan, and begin to think of alternative ideas to just simply getting Jews out of Europe. Because it's, again, something that people really forget, that the Nazis had no plan about what they were doing. It may have been their corner plan of their whole policies, but they really had no plan. And that they intended just to drive Jews out of the Reich and the Greater Reich, which eventually included the Protectorate.
Yeah, I always tell my university and high school students that it's sort of this iterative process. Even in 1933, with anti-Jewish legislation, they have to create the Jewish other, right? So you have to remove the Jews from German society, but how do you do that? It's not the Nuremberg laws at first. It's you can't be in choirs and symphonies, and you can't sit on this bench, and then once we get to, as you said, Rivne is 1941, June 22nd, the invasion of the Soviet Union is sort of when mass murder as a policy sort of begins, but it isn't in gas chambers, it isn't in Auschwitz, it's the Holocaust by bullets.
And of course, one thing that people always forget is actually the first Jews to die in gas vans died in Belgrade. I mean, how many people could actually tell you that one? And most Jews in Serbia had been killed before the Wannsee Conference, and they were killed because the people who were in control in Serbia were trying to, those Nazi commanders were trying to have them deported, but the decision was made by Hitler that he was going to deport the Jews of the Reich, so they had to just stay in Serbia, where they were all shot. It's a very complicated story, but not this is for many other books, but I think something that we should talk about here, because I think this is relevant to people on the beach, is that as the partisans brought people out, literally thousands and thousands of survivors flooded into Bavaria. And what happened in Bavaria in that immediate post-war period is a really extraordinary story.
Yeah, and you sort of highlight two of the individuals that have different ideas of what to do with these survivors. So I wonder if you could talk about, this is Joe Schwartz and Abraham Klausner, right?
Well, there were really a number of key people. Firstly, there was this 30-year-old rabbi called Abraham Klausner, who arrived in Dachau with the American forces. He had so little preparation for what he was about to be confronted with that he had been given, before he left from America, plastic packets with mezuzahs in them. Can you imagine? Mezuzahs to stick on what house? But he was a really imaginative man, and he walked into the barracks, and he said, "I'm here to help you." And then one of the men asked him, "Can you find my brother? He's in the US Army." And Klausner realized he had to do this, but what he did, he was not going to spoon feed these people. They had to help themselves. And he went and he got to search in the vast storerooms in Dachau, and he took them a typewriter and he told them to type up all their names. And he made this very first list, which he took to a printing press in Lamsberg am Lech, which you may know because it's well known, because that's where Hitler wrote Mein Kampf when he was in prison. And he took it there to be printed. Whether he did that because it was furthest away from Dachau that you could get within the American zone, or whether he just relished the irony of it. And he printed this very first list of survivors. Now, these lists had been made before. People made them on the back of board games. They wrote them on the walls of synagogues as they left. But the Sheriff Haptila, which was this list, which was made by Klausner, is one of the most crucial lists. And in fact, in my work, not just with people on the beach, but with many other lists that I've subsequently made, I've relied really heavily on it, because it helps you to see who was where and where at first. And those lists were then published by the World Jewish Congress, and they appeared in newspapers across the world, and they were held at various Jewish organizations across the world where survivors could go and look at them. And this was really important. So firstly, he gave the people their name back. And then what happened was that there began to be an enormous Jewish revival within the DP camps in Bavaria, which is really quite an extraordinary concept, where the survivors began pushing to go to Palestine, but also Klausner and his fellow rabbis were helping the Jewish brigade funnel the survivors out through Austria, over the border at the tiny town of Tarvisio, which remains a tiny town, border town in northeastern Italy. And 85,000 survivors were brought into Italy in the crucial months after the war. And what's very interesting is that whenever you stop and you talk to these survivors who were in Italy, and you ask them how they felt when they arrived in Tarvisio and what happened afterwards, they get so excited and they go, "Civilizzazione, amore." And they're so excited, and they all speak Italian. And I went to interview one in particular, Yechiel Alexander, who's sadly no longer with us, but he spoke Hebrew and Polish, neither of which I speak, and his grandson was translating for me. But as soon as we arrived on his journey into Tarvisio, he literally jumped up saying "amore," and then he was like, "How do you know I spent one night of my life in Tarvisio?" It was like kind of bizarre. And then he started speaking to me in Italian. So then the grandson goes, "I don't know what you're saying, but you're certainly pressing the buttons." And what happened to the survivors when they came to Italy was really quite extraordinary. And you know, the Italians really opened their arms to them. I mean, you know, and helped them, and were extremely kind and helpful. Many fascists were at this point running away, don't forget. Speeding away out of Europe on boats along with Nazis, all from Genoa, I have to say, as quickly as they could go. So the irony is that the people on the beach could well have sat in a cafe, sat next to a Nazi or a fleeing fascist, because of course Eichmann left through Genoa.
Yep. That's the one that when I was reading, when I got to the Italian piece of the book, it's like, oh, these are some of the same exact routes of the rat lines that the Catholic Church uses to get to Genoa and to get out. And
absolutely. And but you know, these Nazis and fascists were mostly sailing on official liners, one has to remember, from Genoa port proper, which was highly policed by the British, which is why the Josiah Wedgwood did not sail from there. It's why it sailed from this tiny port of Vado. And maybe at this point we should come to the boat, because here everyone can see this is a model of the Josiah Wedgwood. And I don't know if you've got any sort of naval experts out there, but it was a Canadian corvette, which was kind of minesweeper, and designed to have about 70 people on it. So as my mother-in-law would say, can you imagine that on this boat were 1,300 people plus some children, because that's what I discovered at the very last moment of my research, that there were young babies on this boat and some children, which I think may have included some Romanian children who'd survived from Transnistria. And the boat it was very important because the Haganah decided they were going to take an enormous risk. And until now, they've been buying boats off local Italian shipyards or Greek shipyards, and sending them off. Sometimes with like 500 people on them, again, massively overloaded. But they decided they were going to turn the heat up, and they brought this boat and they refitted it in New York. And they sailed it with a crew, a tiny crew, of which only one person had any seafaring training. Again, can you believe? And they rock up in this tiny port of Vado, and everyone piles on. And the conditions on this boat were appalling. Many of the younger people who were on the boat were slept on top. And these are an interesting friendship group that I discovered, because 100 of them were taken to a villa called the Villa Bencista, which is in Fiesole above Florence. And just think room with a view, and that is this villa. And that's where they were looked after, and those boys slept on the top. But down below, people were literally like sardines. There was like this much space between the people on the hanging in these hammocks. The conditions were absolutely appalling, although the crossing was relatively easy. It took 7 days, and the sea was quite calm, which, although it was June, you can have terrible storms in the Mediterranean. So they were actually very lucky. But when they got near Haifa, they were boarded by the Royal Navy. And at this point, I think, just to say something on the Royal Navy side, most of the soldiers who had to, sailors who had to board these boats, hated the job and really detested it. And that was the beginning of the British Army kind of unraveling slightly in Palestine at this period. I mean, already they had to say to Jewish soldiers who were called up to serve in Palestine, among whom one was my father-in-law actually, that if you wanted to, you could leave, and he went to Egypt. So it was very difficult. I mean, the British Army had 100,000 men on the ground in Palestine. Can you believe this huge force that was there? And they still could control the place.
That's it's such a fascinating piece. I was writing questions this morning as, more of a statement that the Wedgwood, the sort of the last, couple chapters of the book, the Wedgwood itself becomes a character in the story of how it becomes, the story of taking 1,300 Jewish survivors into Haifa. And in Zippy's mom's story, she writes about, in her memoir, sort of her story, she writes about men and women being sort of segregated. Mostly women were in the hole in below the decks, but luckily for her and her husband, that she got ill and was throwing up and had seasickness despite the sort of the easier crossing. And because of that, they were able
I'll just interrupt you there to say that corvettes are famous for their role.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's like the worst boat that anybody could have brought to do this with, because they're famous for their rocking, rolling procedure, which even on calm waters in June was not very good stuff.
Yeah. My last question before we ask some of the ones in the chat, I think there's so many aspects, there's so many sort of, for a historian, for the everyday reader, there's so many ways to look at the book. I think it has a large audience, right? Holocaust history, immigration, refugees, the founding of Israel, but it is this sort of multitude of individual stories that can tell us about how people responded to being a refugee, or to the Italians, right? And you sort of write this, the Italians should, in some of these small villages, are proud. This is part of their proud history. In sort of a darker time of their history, what lessons can we sort of take about how to grapple with this part of history?
Well, I think the thing is that it's very easy when you're like stuck in a research archive to forget that the Holocaust is not something that happened, years and years and years ago. Obviously, anyone who's got a Holocaust story in their family, it's very much living history, and it lives with you every day. But it lives on in Europe every day, because I mean, amazingly, people live in former concentration camps. that some of these former concentration camps are either appalling social housing like Drancy in Paris, or they're luxury flats like Mechlin, the Kasendossen in Mechlin, which was a transit camp, or it's just a rather nice housing estate in Austria. It's all around you, and actually how people are reacting to it is something that's part of contemporary history and how we understand it. So that I think that the relevance of the Holocaust is how it feeds back into contemporary history, and how it's viewed and how much that can tell you about contemporary society. Is the way that, I mean, every country is a certain has their own Holocaust distortion. Some is worse than others. But why this is happening, particularly in Eastern Europe, is an enormously important question, where they regard this concept of the double genocide, the traumatization by the Nazis and the traumatization is equalized with Stalinism. Unless you begin to understand this, if you look at a place like Romania, which was under Ceausescu and the Securitate, you can see how this lives on. This is very recent history, and I think that this is the lesson, is that not to regard the Holocaust as something that happened a long time ago. And I think this is something that's very important to try to get across in the classroom, that it matters today. We started in Ukraine, so let's end in Ukraine. And as I said, that there's been more memorialization in Western Ukraine since 2014, and certainly since 2020, than there's ever been before. There's also far less anti-Semitism in Ukraine than there's ever been before. On the other side of that, you can say there've never been so few Jews in Ukraine. But to understand what these dynamics are on the ground, and why somebody's creating a Holocaust memorial, and why they're doing this, or why they're remembering the story of the survivors who passed through, is highly relevant. In Italy, it is massively relevant because of migration, across the Mediterranean. And so it's a very important political story, because the left want to bang the right on the head with it. And it's used here in the UK like that. As I said, I mentioned that I work for this organisation, represent the families and their descendants who came as child Holocaust survivors. And one of the things we use all the time is the story of refugee children, and to try to get this torn from home feeling across within the classroom with the boys themselves who still do Holocaust education here, and their families.
Yeah, I think, one of the aspects of the contemporary history is really these places in Eastern Europe are only since 1991 really being able to grapple with 89, 91, being able to really truly grapple with the history of the 1930s and 40s, because it was suppressed under sort of late Stalinism, that especially for Jewish history, the Soviet narrative was the Jewish victims are just part of a larger, right? The Jews are not special, right? There's everyone was a victim. No individual minority group is going to be singled out. And then that part of that sort of political historical narrative is then imposed by the Red Army on the rest of Eastern Europe. And it's
But of
only
course,
when
it's not just in Eastern Europe. I mean, in the last French presidential election, we had Zemmour standing as a presidential candidate. And Zemmour believes that Pétain tried to protect the Jews, and that's why he didn't deport French Jews. Well, excuse me, Mr. Zemmour, the best way to protect Jews is not to deport any Jews. But this debate goes on in France as much as it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's not just, it's all over the place, which is important, and about actually facing up to the myths that swirl across the continent. I suppose I would put it that way.
Yeah. A couple questions from our audience. So one of our members, Patricia, her mom left Budapest and went to Haifa somewhere between 46 and 48, was sort of still trying to track down part of the story, was hoping to find her name on the list in the back of your book, but did not find it. Do you know if it didn't seem like there were a lot of Hungarians on the list. Are there other lists out there that people that are interested in trying to
I think
track
you
down?
have to go to AtLit and ask in AtLit, or if she went, well, of course, actually, after the Wedgwood, the boats that went afterwards, people were interned in Cyprus. So it's a question of whether her mother was interned in Cyprus or if she left in 1948. So, I mean, if she wants to send me a message, I'd be very happy to advise
Yeah,
her.
we could probably put your email into the chat, and that way people can.
That's fine.
Perfect. How much do you think contemporary history, journalism, what stories are covered today, both then and now, right, in the 1930s and 40s, about how things were being covered, sort of skewed our attention or our focus on sort of the historical history of the Holocaust? One of the things you write in the book, or that that this notion that Holocaust denial begins while it was still going on.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's. I mean, the Nazis were the best Holocaust deniers. In the entire thing. That's why the whole point of trickery and deception, and then trying to destroy evidence of mass graves. And one of the reasons that they moved from mass shootings to gassings, because they thought it was also easier to hide the evidence. But going back to journalism, yes, I mean, it's. These stories were exceptionally well covered in the 1930s. There were some extraordinary journalists, notably William Shirer. If nobody's read his Berlin Diaries, I really urge you to take a copy off the shelf. And that he really made an effort after the occupation of Austria, or the Anschluss, and he reported from Vienna about everything that was going on. It didn't really make a difference because people were not going to change their policies. It's like always, I mean, the way you see it always, it's like, oh no, it's never going to happen. I mean, I have to say, I've personally been guilty of that in the past. I remember going with my husband to Sarajevo the weekend the war broke out in Bosnia, and saying it's never going to happen. So, I mean, I'm king of never going to happen as well. But it is easy to think like that, to think, no, this is the worst case scenario. This is never going to happen. But of course, in the run up, nobody really knew what was going on. They didn't really understand it. And then it begins to happen when it begins to get too late. So in the House of Commons here in December 1941, they had 2 minutes silence for the dead Jews of Eastern Europe. Everybody knew what was going on. It just wasn't on the front page. And it was suppressed in being reported on the BBC World Service by the British government. There was a reluctance to report it because they did not want people to think that they were fighting for the Jews. And Britain was a very anti-Semitic country. You were talking about Kielce. We had our own little mini pogrom, which nobody was killed in, but it was a terrible outburst of violence in August 1946, there was a huge reluctance. There was also, it's difficult to understand what you can do. The official line was the only way to save the Jews is to win the war. There was a reluctance, as we all know, this debate about bombing Auschwitz and what would have done. But as we can see now in contemporary in Ukraine, it's like people are like faffing about, going like, oh, I don't know whether we're going to send some more arms, what we're going to do, what we're going to do. And then before you get there, it's all too late. Yep. As I said to you, that things get worse. It gets, as the Russians say, it's the darkest is just before dawn. That was when it was just after dawn that it really hit people what had happened. But even then, even though there were, some of those newsreels that were made at Bergen-Belsen in the case of Dachau for the Americans, they were really important news stories, and everybody saw these newsreels in the cinema. The liberation of Auschwitz was not. It was believed to be Soviet propaganda. And it didn't get much coverage in the Soviet press either, because they'd already gone over, well, they'd already had big headlines at Majdanek, and they'd had a trial. And basically, that was enough for Stalin. So Auschwitz wasn't very famous at all. But it's about, well, what else are you going to report? You have to remember that the war hadn't finished in the Far East. It's really, really difficult. I don't like to defend editors too much, but I was an editor at the BBC World Service, and I know how difficult it is to say, I don't want to do that story today. And it's also really difficult with resources and and getting to people. And you know, one of the reasons that my husband's a reporter is that his grandmother was murdered in Auschwitz, and I know he's always thought if there'd been reporters in Auschwitz, it might have been very different.
Yeah, the compartmentalization of information is, it was, you know, early on, it's hard to get everything out. You know, we have Churchill having some of the first reports coming out of Germany, or out of the east, of mass shootings of Jews, but it's also, I mean, he's in his books talking about, if we say we know these things, somebody's going to ask, well, how do you know? Right? What codes have been broken? What are we giving up militarily if we let this information out all at once?
Precisely, ordinary people had other things on their mind. War is an all-consuming activity, and it draws people into themselves just at the moment they need to be drawn out of themselves. And that's inevitable because they suddenly have less money, they have less food, they're worried about the future, they suddenly can have relatives having to come to stay with them who've come from, had to leave places. And that was the same in London, you know, after the Blitz of London and Liverpool and Glasgow, people had to go and stay with relatives in the country. There were other people, just other things on people's minds. And I think also you have to see it in that bigger context. And I think it's very important for children in the classroom to understand that, because otherwise it's all focused on the Holocaust. And you know, I don't know what the statistics are in America, but we've got some rather nasty statistics here, which show that most British school children think that Britain went to war to save the Jews. I'm just like, oh dear.
Yeah, I think the British survey came out maybe a year after the claims conference in New York had a survey of, you know, most millennials don't think 6 million is an accurate number, thinks it's too high, can't name Auschwitz. Yeah. Yeah, I think Zippy, I know you wanted to say something before we wrap things up, if you're available.
I would love to say something, because Josh and Rosie, you gave me the best gift. For many of you, I don't know if you know, but I'm the founder of this organization, and for 13 years, we have been bringing unbelievable stories and journalists and documentaries, but this one is really special for me. I'm very thankful, Josh, for introducing me to Rosie, and to, you know, Rosie, you're an amazing journalist. I grew up in Israel, and, you know, my mom was a partisan, but she never really talked about the journey. In her diary, she only mentioned, you know, half a page about the journey. And she said that when they arrived to Palestine, the captain switched clothes with a guy that was handicapped. He didn't have a leg. And he changed his clothes and disappeared among the people that ended up, you know, going to Athlete. I never really knew anything, but the excitement of having your book and seeing my parents' name in the book, Litvak Herschel. Herschel was my father, you know, may he rest in peace. And Litvak Rachel was my mother. They both came from Baranovich. It's only mentioned that she did. But to see it in writing and to know that it's true, you know, it's very hard. And I'm sure that maybe many of our participants are second generation, or some of them. And I grew up with no past. I really didn't know until 10 years ago when I went to Belarus and discovered stuff. So what a gift, and I'm very thankful. And I can't wait, Rosie, to meet you in person and to hear a lot more, and maybe go and see the villa in Italy and see where it was.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, I do so much for so many survivors. We support educators, and every year we take educators to Poland and subsidize their study seminar. But you know, I really have to do this. It's already late, because you told me that there is still 1 or 2 people that are still living that went on the journey.
Yes, yeah, there are. Yitzhak Kaplan that I talked about, he's still very much alive.
So I will follow up with you to hear what else he can tell us about the journey.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm very thankful. I don't know if anybody else has any comments. And
I was just thinking, like, when Rosie and I spoke maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and I had sent her Zippy's mom's story, and the one thing we sort of giggled about was she talks about being in sauna, right? That, like, a spa, but we didn't know what it was at all, right? This notion of savona, right? That how trying to track down these places on what they wrote down versus what was the spelling and things. Like, it was a great way to sort of have those little moments of, okay, all this makes sense now. We can't trying to track down another place that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that was very funny. That really did make me laugh. But actually, the really funny thing about it was, there's always like a karma here, is that when Josh, I arranged to have a Zoom with Josh, and I'm actually currently writing a guidebook to Holocaust memorials and sites across Europe, which is out in the autumn. And I was actually writing the paragraph about Branovitz, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, I better just stop, because what does this person want to talk to me about this afternoon? And I thought, I better read about this lady. Who is this woman? And then I was like, oh my God, she's from Branovitz. And I thought, bing, it was just like the weirdest connection. It was so funny.
Yeah. Well, then once we talked, and I said, I'd travel every summer with Howard Chandler, and you're like, oh my gosh, I work with the boys, and yeah. So
Yeah, well, if anyone wants to know more about Howard Chandler's, the group that Howard Chandler came in, the organization I work for was called the 45 Aid Society. And we have a website with a big, extensive historical pages, which were written by me and a team of second and third generation. No, third and fourth generation. Second generation were too busy. And we wrote a whole series of profiles and historical accounts of how those children came to the UK and who they were. So again, that's another great list there, because I had to make a list of all who they were, because they didn't know who they were either. And so there's another list, and you can check out all his story if you're interested in knowing how he came to Britain.
I can't wait, Rosie, for your book to be published. And I don't know how many of our participants here on this Zoom are from Pittsburgh, but we're looking forward to having you in Pittsburgh and teaching our teachers and sharing your stories. And
well, my new book is called Two Sisters, Love.
Can you talk about it for a moment?
Yeah, my new book is called Two Sisters, Love, Resistance, and Betrayal in Wartime France. And it's about my mother-in-law and my mother-in-law and her sister. And it grew out of a trip that we took to San Francisco in 2019, see my husband's aunt, who's still alive. And she was hidden in the Alps in the winter of 1943 by a doctor called Dr. Petrie. And she had broken her leg. It's a long story here, but by taking her in, he saved her life, and he inadvertently saved my mother-in-law's life. And when we went to San Francisco, she's called Huguette's 90 something, and still troubled by the fact that she was never able to thank him because he died before she could go back. And I said to her, look, if you didn't thank him, we could find this family and thank them. And when I found the family, Huguette said to me, she was a teacher, which is relevant for all of you guys here. She said, why don't we put him forward to be recognized as righteous among nations? So we put forward Dr. Petrie to be recognized as rightful among nations, which he is now. But in the process of, it's a very, very complicated thing. If any of you have done it, you have to put a whole dossier together to give to the committee. You have to prove the danger that somebody's in, and you have to prove that no money was exchanged, and also that there was repetitive righteous among nations activity. And in the process of doing this, I began to discover a lot of things about my mother-in-law that I didn't know, and that she was in the resistance. And the moment that she and Huguette found themselves in the Alps in danger was a few months after their mother had been deported to Auschwitz. And they were both born in Berlin. So that story begins in Berlin and goes on to France, which is why I was mentioning Eric Zemmour, because, we're all French citizens. And it's interesting. We all love France. We spend a lot of time there. We've got a lot of family there. So it's kind of like, it's again, coming to terms with the Holocaust on your own doorstep. But that's my book, and it's coming out with Union Square in the autumn. And again, on top of that, there's the guidebook to Holocaust sites and memorials of Europe, which is with Bratt.
Thank you.
Thank you so much today, Rosie.
That was a pleasure. Really nice. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'll be sure to include all of those links in our follow-up email. Rosie, if you could send me the link to your new book that's coming out this fall. I couldn't find it quickly in my
I don't think
email.
there's a front cover yet. There's been, so it's, I will when I've got the front cover, but
All right.
I think it's in the catalogue, but I'm not sure. It's,
Terrific, terrific. I want to thank you all for joining us for today's event. A very special thank you to Rosie and Josh for this enlightening discussion. Thank you, Sippy, for joining us and sharing this personal connection. We hope that you'll join us all for our next event this Wednesday at 3 p.m. featuring our post-film discussion, Children of Peace, with Maayan Schwartz, the writer and director, and of course, our Classrooms Without Borders in-house scholar, Avi Ben-Hur, as well as for many more upcoming community events. I'm going to drop into the chat our event page. You can sign up for all our events and more on that event page. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.